Okay, now we're ready to begin the final game of life, which is just a much larger grid, but we're also using those arrays, so we're not going to show step by step like we did in the small grids. I said we'd talk about global variables. Global variables you want to avoid as much as possible. Again, most programs are written by teams, and anytime there's a global variable, everybody has to know the name of that global variable so they don't use it, otherwise it overrides it. Meaning if I have a global variable of x, anytime in a local routine I use x, I've just kind of wiped out the value of that well, I haven't wiped out the value of the global variable. I no longer have access to that global variable in that subroutine that overrode it. It's kind of like if you have 3 Toms in the classroom, programming just says, no, we don't allow it, and we kind of pick the closest Tom. So that's the logic here. So you do want to avoid it or make it really clear. That's why I said in this one, because there would be so many passing of parameters. And it's like, okay, I'm going to let you use some globals. But I did suggest that you make a module that we list these. So the public makes it so that everyone can see it. And not everyone, meaning a person, but all of these different modules can see these and know these global variables. And it doesn't matter that this is called global. That was just for our information. It could be module 1 or 2 or whatever. CONST stands for constant. So that's just a hint that that one should not be changed by the programmers, or it should not be changed within the program. And so then I did large rows and large calls. So these are numbers. I could easily change these here, and that would instantly increase the size of my grid when I go to run it. And then I did a start row and a start column. Armageddon's a Boolean. This is just to keep track if life exists or doesn't exist. Ultimately, I'm going to have you do this so that it loops 10 times. Well, it shouldn't loop 10 times if life ceases after 3 times. So that's what we need that for. Count generations is so we can keep track of which generation we're on. Then these are the arrays that I'm making. So this is the public neighbors count one, which remember on our little grid, we had that second grid that showed how many neighbors we have. This time it's not going to be visible. It's just going to be kept in this array. And then public life exists. Again, ultimately, before we know if life ceases in this cell or not, some of the criteria were if life exists. So there are only 2 cells. If life existed before, it still does, but otherwise it does not exist in that cell if it only has 2 neighbors. So that information. And this is the random number generator, 0 and 1, and I know you've used that before. I don't know if I really explained it. So down here in the comments, I did say if I did it like this row right here, that would give me random numbers between 1 and 10. So just trying to explain how that works. So put all of this in your globals module, and then you're ready to, kind of ready to start going here. Then I created a new one called Game of Life. Created these buttons so you can see what's going on. This one clears the grid, so that one I'll fill it up with grid. So this clears the grid, which is what we expect to happen, and then I can hand enter the grid however I want to. Here's where I clear it and then fill it in. You do know that anytime this is done, I can go in and I can delete one here, add one here, whatever I want. And then what we want is this. Don't worry about this button until we get everything else going. Here you click to see the next generation. So it's counting those neighbors. It's finding out if there's life. It's keeping track of all of that in the arrays and then printing out whether there's life or not in this one and counting the generations. So that's what you want yours to do. Now, I'm not giving you all the code, but let me go to Visual Basic. So I started a module here for Game of Life to hold all this code. And I'm going to shrink this up so I can see how much I want to show at a given time. So, okay, this is where I cleared that grid. I do reset the count generations to the first one, and then I put in there this is in that cell 215, that count generations. If we come back here, that's this one. I did merge these cells and center it, and so this cell is all considered N2, and then this one is P2. So you just need to know that for when you're putting in this here. And so here's the 2, and N is 15. That's where that came from. And then start large life. So this is the one that just clears the grid, resets the generation to 1, allowing you to enter information. Button large life is this button right here, clearing the grid, randomly filling with life, which is fill the random life, which is much like we did the fill the random life in our small grid, except we have larger columns and rows, a larger grid this time. And then again, filling in that generation, which is going to be 1, and then count generations. And the reason I have this current generation in there in quotes is when I clear this, actually it doesn't clear that, but that's why I put it in there. At one time it did clear it. And now, well, it clears it, but it puts it back in there. Let me comment this one out. Then you'll see why it's in there. So now I clear this, and that stays gone. So that was so I could clear the whole worksheet. And then I still want that information in here. Then the filling the random life, that's what we're calling right here. And so again, here's where, and I'll show you this one so you can kind of get an idea here. So here's where I did start row, which is that global variable, and then I did to start row plus large rows. So start row, this will give me my end row. I started at 5 and I have 12 rows, so it's going from 5 to 17, and then this one's going to go 2 to 13. And if you look at this, this does go 5 to 17 and 5 to 17 this way, sorry, rows, and 2 to 13 this way. If we come in here and count the columns, let's go 2, 3, and go this way. And this is just so you can see the column count. And it does go to 13. So that's where those numbers come from. And so that is filling in that section. Let me see, we got back to that one. Button 10 generations, that one we're not ready to talk about, so I'm going to quickly go past that. So button next generation, this one, each time I set it, I set Armageddon to false, so that then as I'm going, I'm looking to see if there's 1 life, and if so, then I set that back to true. Determine life, this is just like we did before. Actually, it's not like we did before. This is where we have the array. Let's go back to the globals for a minute. So we have 2 arrays. One is the neighbors count, and one is life exists. So this one, I'm going through each cell at one at a time, and I'm saying, is there an asterisk there? If so, then, and this is a Boolean one, then life exists as true, else life exists as false. And we need that, so when we're doing the next generation, remember there was 1 or 2 tests that we had to know if life existed before, then does it still exist or not? And that's what that one's for, so we can go through and find that information out. If we come back to our small grids, here we would come back here and we'd look and say, is there life here? Then we'd look at it and the neighbors count to determine if life existed, ceased, or was reborn. So that's that same logic. We're doing it here, but from an array. Then count large neighbors. We're counting the neighbors just like we did before, except we're now storing it in an array. This one I did a little bit different this time, so I will show you that one. And then displaying the next generation is where we look at that information and determine. Then I increment count generations to count generations plus 1. And here's where I said if Armageddon equals false, which meant I went all the way through this determined life. I didn't find a single life, so Armageddon will remain false. And so then I'm going to say life ceased after X generations. So I said I was going to look at count large neighbors. So you could actually go to The previous one, if we look at the grid small life, and here's where we count the neighbors, where I went through and said, look at that and look for if you did. So I said you look at the row above it, the row that it's on, the row below it, and determine that count. You could actually call this one and send it the right variables, even though it's in a different module. You could just call counting neighbors and it would return that number. That'd be one way to do it. But I wanted to show you another way, and in this one, I just looked here, I did a nested loop, and so I'm actually just looking, if you visualize it, I'm just looking at, let's go to large life, I'm looking at these 9 cells, and I'm counting how many of them have an asterisk in them. And then before I return that number, because I'm counting my neighbors, oh, just a minute. Oh, this is where I showed it all, just a minute. Oh, okay, it's over in here, this one right here. Here we go. Here's my nested one. Then if life exists in that particular one that I'm on, I have to lower that count by 1. So I said I'm going through and I'm counting these 9 cells, but remember that middle cell is the one where we're actually evaluating right here. So we don't want to count this one as a neighbor. We're not our own neighbor, and so that's why we have this one decrementing by 1. So go ahead and get that one in there if you want. The other things you've pretty much done before, it's just a larger grid. So I'm not going to give you more code than that, but we'll see how you do with this. Then ultimately, when that's done, that's when you'll come through, and then you can just do a loop that calls this one, and I will show you that one. Whoops, this one is the button next generation. Then you come through here, 10 generations, so rounds is 1, and I said while rounds is less than 10 and life still exists, this is the Armageddon, then we call this one the button next generation. So that's how you get it to do the 10 rounds. So I'll click here, and then if I just click on this, it's showing the rounds, and I can click for 10 more rounds, and it stopped before we got to 21 because life ceased after 17 generations. So that's all the code I'm giving you on this one. I am expecting some questions. I'll start watching for questions in the question area of this in Brightspace. And we'll see how far we go, and I might have to give more code, but we'll get started from there. So go ahead, see how far you can get, let me know, turn it in if you get it done. Thank you.